Hello, my name is Cameron Hill, and in this video I'll be going over my bank essay for Dr. Campbell's class. Coming off the War of 1812, there was a need for financial stability due to incoordination with government finances. Thus, the Second Bank of the United States, better known as the BUS, was created. However, the central bank created new forms of controversy, going beyond just government finances, revealing imbalance and further chaos deeply rooted within democracy. President Andrew Jackson, after his re-election, campaigned for the dismantlement of the bus. This is where former reports, including the McDuffie Report and Bus Directors Report, came into play to attempt to clear up misconceptions and argue for the bank. Correspondences between prominent figures like President Jackson himself, political influencers, bank insiders, and media outlets also touched on these arguments. This back and forth between sanctions for and against the bank revealed the public's belief of the importance of the bus because it questioned American democracy and institutional trust. Now, the McDuffie Report was one of the defenses and coverages of the central bank, and it was written by George McDuffie. It was to defend the bank, and it was sectioned into questions that were answered in favor of defending the central bank. The points to discuss that were discussed were if the central bank was constitutional and if it was practical, both of which he answered for the bank. The first section of the report details and questions whether the national bank was constitutional or not. Now, this answers the question of the prompt on arguments for and against the bank because Andrew Jackson, one of his main arguments against the national bank was that it was not constitutional. Now, in the McDuffie report, he goes through a good amount of information um, regarding exacts about what makes it constitutional, and I chose this quote. But where the power exercised is clearly conducive to the public welfare and its constitutionality is merely doubtful. I chose this quote because it sums up overall his findings within the investigation. He made it clear that um, the national bank was in fact constitutional, and that's exactly why I chose this quote because it really summarizes that idea and emphasizes that point to go against Andrew Jackson's claims. It also is interesting to note that he would talk about the idea of party excitement a lot, and this gives a little bit of reason why this whole controversy was really important to the American people because it was the beginning of this divide between parties. Now, another section of the McDuffie report describes the positive practicalities of the national bank. Now, I did not choose any quotes exactly for uh, this part of the document, but he describes how the currency has depreciated over time due to inflation without the national bank, and he gives specific values of the uh, inflation for specific states. And to support the national bank, he argues that the depreciation of currency would have no limit, and this being due to importing foreign goods and the creation of more state banks. McDuffie also talks about the government's treasury, the large hit that it took during wartime efforts, strengthening his position that without the national bank, there would be much more of this bad government spending from the treasury. Now, overall, this report was significant for accounting the controversy around the bank by documenting conflicting pros and cons, with the pros being inflation stability and the cons being that questionable but debunkable constitutionality of the bank. And it also exemplifies important aspects of the bank's influence on the people of the country, giving further reason why the Americans found it so important to discuss this controversy. Now, besides the publicized report like McDuffie's, there are also many correspondences on both sides of the argument between central figures, displaying further controversies for and against the bank while also elevating the scope of the entire controversy. A prime example of these correspondences was that of President Andrew Jackson himself and James A. Hamilton. In the back and forth letter between James A. Hamilton, he displays clearly the central bank's arguments that he actually derived from McDuffie. Now I have them highlighted in yellow here, and here the quote is the objections to the present bank are one, it's unconstitutional, two, is dangerous to liberty, and he continues by saying it cheapens and facilitates all physical operations of the government. Now, Hamilton sums up the argument for and against a bank, further emphasizing through repetition that the main controversy stems from these points. But I also chose this quote because I thought it was interesting that he was directly speaking to Andrew Jackson, and he was trying to give positive affirmation towards the bank, even to Andrew Jackson, to give a little bit of a rebuttal without directly arguing for the bank. And I thought this was interesting as we further talk about some of the power dynamics of Andrew Jackson and the whole democracy itself. Now, besides that, this controversy did not stay centralized to just fiscal discussions, but grander political discussion, as seen in the letter between James Robertson and Nicholas Biddle. James Robertson directly describes how the renewal of the bank was, in quote, in this blue quote, um, in the James Robertson and Nicholas Biddle correspondence. He says it's entirely and almost exclusively a political one. Now, this emphasizes the belief that there had been a shift from this economic discussion of the bank to a more purely political controversy regarding the bank. And I chose this quote because it really just shows that a lot of people, like Robertson, believe that this controversy of the bank just went beyond uh, monetary policies, and it's was really significant to many Americans at the time because the initial arguments for and against the bank started as this purely physical idea, but then it evolved into one that required more public participation and opinion. Now, moving on to another formal report, the bus director's report was another response against President Andrew Jackson's attack against the bank. The report was directed as a defense to the president's specific claim that the second bank was monstrous and negatively impacting the country. And this discussion or this report details specific power dynamics of the president and the bank promoting and it promotes its way of funding the media. And its main argument is the president technically had no control over the removal of deposits, but used loopholes to gain control. And it also tries to restore trust in the bank through media funding and promotion. Now, the first section of the bus director's report relates to the director's view on whether President Andrew Jackson had the power over the Second Bank of America. Now, the report concluded that the president, in fact, did not have power and instead the power belonged to Congress. Although the report emphasizes how the Treasury of the United States is part of the executive branch, they insist that this did not give the power to the president. It instead details how the Secretary of Treasury remains independent from the president's control and is only instated by the president. The report highlights this specifically when talking about the influence of the bank, where this quote in magenta in the bus director's report says here, it was in fact the leading principle in organizing the bank that the president should be excluded from all control of it. Now, this created a sound constitutional distinction between the president's power versus assignment, which is definitely an important aspect in the discussion against the bank because it uh, reverts attention away from the bank and more points fingers at the president, which kind of grands the scope of this whole idea as it really starts talking about corruption in democracy. Now, and this is further emphasized when Andrew Jackson attempted to get around this through judiciary trial and power over appointing. The report highlights how the president had control to question the validity of the bank and bring them to trial. And it also talks about how William Dwayne refused to remove deposits and how he was fired by the president. And it describes this loophole by saying, quote, at this moment, the whole revenue of the country is at the disposal and the absolute uncontrolled controlled disposal of the president. Now, this goes back into talking about how the president tried to use these loopholes, even though he technically had no power over the bank, and this really grand that scope of this controversy and answers the prompt on why this controversy grew to its scale and why people thought it was such an important controversy. The board believed it was within the bank's right to defend itself against the president's claim, which led to media influence. Now, the directors talk about these points in the specific quote here in magenta where it says the Bank of the United States, like every other bank, derives much of its advantages from its credit and its general reputation for solvency. Now, this is an important idea, and this is why I chose this quote, as it gives more justification to why the bank spent a lot of its funds for media promotion, which is a question of the people of its spending, which is another a bit of a controversy and a argument against the bank that they're using a bit of suspicious spending. But it also goes into that talk between democracy and power, which is why the this bank war itself grew in scope and why it was so important to the people. And it revealed the power hunger of the president and further publicized the drama of the bank war. Now, this nature of the president can even be seen as hypocritical, but a fair argumentative display in relation to the funding of the Washington Globe. In this other primary source from the September 8th, 1832 Globe uh, paper, following Andrew Jackson's own personal contempt of the bank, it describes the bank as having, in this red quote, all controlling power over the currency of the country and gradually drawing with it the irresistible political influence. Now, I chose this quote because I feel like it completely goes against the quote that the bus directors made, where they said that the whole revenue of the country is at the disposal and the absolute disposal of the president, because this directly goes against that as a rebuttal. Because now President Jackson was saying that the bank had all controlling power over the currency. Now, Andrew Jackson, using the influence of the bank, argued that the bank was truly the institution that had the most control over the United States instead of the executive power, thus needing it to be controlled and stopped. The bus director's report was significant in defending the bank's existence through redirection regarding the presidential power, but the September 1832 issue of the Globe demonstrated the exact opposite, and that's why I chose those two quotes. They also illustrate public opinion, showing the function of democracy, and using the bank as a medium to fight against perceived political corruption. Both these signify the importance of the bus to the people and how it went beyond just financial controversy, but touched on further public concerns of non democratic presidential and institutional power.
Now, though the bus directors tried to directly address media coverage, Thomas Cadwallader, an insider of the bank, further pointed out some of these questionable actions regarding this media coverage. Thomas Cadwallader's letter to Nicholas Biddle further revealed nuances within the controversy regarding the public's view of the bank, specifically an argument against the bank's secrecy and questionable media coverage. Thomas Cadwallader was concerned with the lack of transparency and spending of the printers. Now, printers here is highlighted in dark green, which here we have the transcript that I created for the Thomas Cadwallader's letter to Nicholas Biddle, where he uses the word printers to refer to the media coverage. Upsetting behavior within the institution system is apparent in Cadwallader's letter when it describes here in dark green that of the amount of particulars of these loans, I have no recollection, where he then continues to say, I have then great reason to complain that I have that no information has been given to me. Now, I chose these two quotes because it demonstrates the troubling arguments. Demonstrates further troubling arguments against the bank, highlighting suspicious confidentiality within the banks that raises individuals' concerns like Thomas Cadwallader's. Now, this lack of transparency alongside the loans to the printers that had been carried too far under the quote that Thomas Cadwallader used at the beginning of his letter argues a system of incoordination within the bank. Now, this answers the prompt of an argument against the bank, saying that there was incoordination in the bank. This is important to the overall idea that the discussion and existence of the bus was important also because it highlights concerns with democracy and power. With the bank controlling finances of America, the public, like Cadwallader, had the right to check the actions of the bank and be concerned with its spendings and confidentiality. The Second Bank of the United States created a war that went just beyond monetary purpose. Despite it being called the Bank War, it blossomed from an argument against constitutionality and effectivity into a discussion that went deeper into political power and trust. In the several primary sources and the quotes I chose, I described different defenses for and against the bank, like the constitutionality. I described annoyance of lack of trust, specifically in Thomas Cadwallader's arguments in his note to Nicholas Biddle. and displays of undemocratic political power displayed from the Globe and the bus directors report, all highlighting and answering the prompt of why Americans viewed this issue as such a significant one. Thank you.